Baljeet from Phineas and Ferb, Ravi from Jessie, Raj from The Big Bang Theory. What do they all have in common? They speak in stereotypically broken English. They have accusations of scamming occasionally leveled at them. And they're strangely foreign. These are all examples of characters caked in brownface. Brownface is the imitation of South Asian culture in a way that perpetuates harmful stereotypes. Stereotypes are harmful beyond mere playground bullying. They fuel mistrust between groups. They reduce individuality within a group. And they limit acceptable opportunities for self-exploration. So, with all this backstory, a few years ago, if you were to ask me when the origin of stereotypes against Indian Americans was, I probably would have told you the tech boom of the 1990s. But what if I told you they actually originated over a century before then? In part, stereotypes against Indian Americans are so normalized simply because we haven't had a rooted diaspora in the United States until relatively recently. Prior to 1965, virtually no Indian immigration to the United States was allowed. So this means there are a few third, fourth, and fifth generation Indian Americans who can clear up these misunderstandings from an American perspective. But that's not to say there were no early Indian Americans. In fact, I've done extensive research on India's early American transplants. And from that, I found an article from 1852 in a newspaper from Painesville, Ohio. In this article, Lakshman Roy waltzed into Painesville, ready to elucidate audiences through his knowledge and experiences on the very real and very serious subject matter of, quote, Oriental magic. So, intrigued by this, I kept looking, and I found an immense paper trail spanning over 3 decades, where Roy lectured extensively on Orientalism and Indian cultural heritage. In these articles, we learned that he was claiming to be the nephew of Ram Mohan Roy, a noted Bengali reformer. And he claimed to have been brought over from India to Andover, Massachusetts to study at an early age. So I decided to see as much as I could learn about Roy's life and understand the circumstances that brought him to the United States. In the 1860 census, we see that he was born in Hindustan, an archaic term for all of South Asia. The race column is blank. In this time, race was defaulted to white. This meant that a blank race column implied that he was white. In fact, any deviation from whiteness was to be marked, so he certainly would have known had Roy been a person of color. I was curious as to what was going on, so I looked to the 1870 census. In here, it's cleared up a little bit. An 1861 newspaper article, however, provides a conflicting identity. It gives his name as George W. Ellis. He was the alias of a Cincinnati treasonist. And I was so intrigued by this that I looked to the 1870 census. The same white born in Hindustan dichotomy was presented. However, the 1870 census is a bit peculiar. It was the federal government's first attempt to track not only the birthplaces of its constituents, but the birthplaces of their parents as well. In the columns for father of foreign birth and mother of foreign birth, well, there's no mark, implying that he was of American parentage. The background behind why a white man would have been born in Hindustan to two American parents are as murky then as they are now. So I looked to the 1880 census. I mean, surely this will clear stuff up. And the birthplace is New York. And the birthplaces of his parents are also New York. So that's just completely conflicting what I'd previously found. The name is still Lakshman Roy, so we know this is the right guy. But I'm curious as to who he really was and why the information about his life keeps shifting. And I'm wondering, is he really one of the earliest Indian American immigrants? So I looked to obituaries. I mean, surely everything is cleared up in death. And his obituaries provide an intriguing layer of complexity. Born in New York, 2, a US consul to India. That certainly would explain why he had so much knowledge of India to present to two audiences that he lectured to. And this is where I came across the genealogist maxim. Disproof is often easier than proof. What do I mean by this? If I listed out every identity of Roy and that he claimed to have, and I went by and systematically eliminated each one, when I was left with one final identity, that would be as good as proving one outright. So, ladies and gentlemen, place your bets. Who is Lakshman Roy? Is he the nephew of a Bengali reformer, Ram Mohan Roy? Is he the son of the US consul to India? Or is he George W. Ellis, a Cincinnati treasonist? Well, he couldn't have been Ram Mohan Roy's nephew, as the Roy family is an illustrious, well-documented one. In Bengali court records, neither of Roy's brothers mentioned mentioned Roy in their large estates, so this was unlikely. In the government roles for US consuls, there was no man with the surname of Roy who could have been a candidate for Lakshman's father, so that was a no-go. Then there was George W. Ellis. Here, I wasn't immediately able to disprove it, but I found 3 pieces of correlating evidence. 1, while not the consul's son himself, George W. Ellis did serve as the US consul to Bombay, a city in India. 2, he lectured extensively on phrenology and Orientalism. Pseudosciences, yes, but they would also serve as primitive versions of the topics Lakshman Roy later discussed at length in his lectures. So this was another piece of correlating evidence. Also, the last times that he appeared advertising for his lectures just so happened to coincide with Lakshman Roy's first lecture advertisements. Finally, he had a documented connection to Andover, Massachusetts, the same college Lakshman Roy claimed to attend. So the evidence is irrefutable. Lakshman Roy is George W. Ellis. So who's that? In the 1830s, he attended Andover College in Massachusetts. This school was overwhelmingly white at the time. In the 1840s, he served as the consul of the US to Bombay. This was a position that would not have come easy to a person of color or even somebody of foreign birth at the time in the United States. So he would have had to have been white, and he would have had to have an immense amount of privilege to gain this esteemed role. So then he disappears for several years until he reemerges in 1861 in that article about his treason. He was arrested for supporting secession. In this time, he had the privilege to make a choice of what side he wanted to be on in the Civil War. And he made the choice of secession in favor of slavery. So what's the big issue? Why does Lakshman Roy, the brownface act of George W. Ellis, matter so much today? George W. Ellis was a man with an intense amount of privilege, from going to college in the 1830s to being the US consul to being able to lecture freely and not take a stable job. And with this intense amount of privilege, he chose to perpetuate stereotypes that harmed the very community he was co-opting. In this, he didn't just commit brownface, but he shifted the language around which we talk about Indian Americans. There were few Indian Americans at the time, so there weren't a lot of people to debunk these ludicrous claims about India's culture and people. Instead, he planted an insidious seed of racism that was able to grow pervasively throughout this country. And it was spread largely by the people who attended his lectures. They didn't have malintent while doing this, but they were simply misinformed and didn't have anybody to correct them on the misinformation they were later spreading. So the characters that I saw growing up, mocking my racial identity, are direct reflections of the same insidious ideas that Lakshman Roy started over a century ago. And this is not new. I mean, it's everywhere. It's the kid in my class who thinks he can do a great Indian accent. It's the video on Instagram with over 1 million views making fun of, haha, Indian street food is so dirty. And it's the conversations I have with myself in the mirror, wondering why it is that minorities have to not only not follow, but actively defy stereotypes just to be taken seriously. So with all this misinformation, how can we combat it? I mean, it seems overzealous to even think about correcting a mistake from centuries ago. So how do we correct this? One word: history. History clears up misunderstandings, but it's so much more than that too. History shapes our relationships with each other. When we understand history, we learn to adapt to changes. We stop looking at that which is new as something to treat with mistrust, and we start looking at it with inquisitiveness. History isn't a one and done thing. If the brown face and the cultural appropriation of Lakshman Roy was a disease that carries over into the Indian American myth today, history is its cure. We need to look at bad history, like Lakshman Roy, like the Indian American myth, and in its place, allow good history to thrive. And what exactly is that good history? I have a couple of suggestions. There's Henry Herbert Swanston. He was a black freedman in 1890s Galveston who took on a new identity as an Afghan lawyer. He shows us that ethnic identity was and is fluid and was often a survival strategy. There's Joseph Wagstaff. He was a Sri Lankan transplant who in 1899 committed suicide in Sutter Creek, California. His granddaughter, seeing this, shirked her South Asian heritage and passed as white. He shows us that identity is something that can haunt us long after we're dead. There's Majid Khan, a man from my ancestral neck of the woods, Andhra Pradesh. He was turned away from the United States in 1909. Officially for Tacoma, but in reality amidst a racist panic against Indian immigration. He shows us that sometimes the land of the free was more free for some than others. There's Ida Ongol, the only Telugu speaker recorded on the 1910 census. She shows us that pioneers exist across race, class, and gender. And finally, there's George W. Ellis, examined not for the stereotypes he perpetuated, but for the personhood and humanity he had. Often, he shows us racial profiling and racism is not a born trait, but it comes from a deep desire to fit in and be accepted. He didn't just commit brownface. He shifted our collective language. In understanding the documents he left behind, we can unravel that language. And in understanding that, we understand why anti-Indian racism is so prevalent today. And I want to bring you back to the idea that history is not this static thing based on data. When we dismantle these myths about minority groups through history, we are weaving the threads of acceptance. You see, history isn't this completed tapestry on a wall that we can just look at and say, oh, that's nice. It's this patchwork we are knitting right now with every action we take and every choice we have about how we judge different groups of people. History is not a then thing. We can't just cut ourselves off. It's like cutting off an arm or a leg. It just doesn't work. When we place ourselves away from history, we make it brown-face then. But when we appreciate our lives' historical context and fully center ourselves in our own historical narrative, we are able to end brown-face now. Thank you.